This is your official sector trends this morning. Get us online at Metropole TVKE across all your social media platforms. I am at Kiage Simba. Now today we speak to our youth and especially those in the rural areas on how best they can empower themselves economically as well as highlight the viable economic activities they can engage in. Now to put this into perspective, we're joined by Willis Ogutu, who is the assistant manager in the private development sector at Microsoft Consulting, a global consulting firm that enables social, financial, and economic inclusion for everyone in the digital age. Willis, good morning, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Kiage.
Happy to have you around, sir. Let's get into that conversation this morning. Now, in this digital age, the rural areas are quite advanced in a huge way from infrastructure, first-hand information, and technology is playing a big role in it. But first, let's define what the rural economy and why the youth essentially, especially in 2021.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Mr. Kiage, for that very important question. I'm so excited to talk about youth matters and especially rural matters.
Yes.
Because this is a very, very critical topic if you talk about economic development of any nation. Rural, a simple definition of a rural area is simply a place located outside towns and cities. I mean, there could be other definitions like the U.S. Census Bureau talks about population or housing territory are not included within an urbanized cluster. So basically, that's a rural area. And it's also important to understand what we mean when we talk about the youth. And this definition usually comes in different contexts. So we will take the Kenyan context, which we can find from the Constitution of Kenya in Article 260, which defines the youth by age bracket. So it puts it at 18 to 34. So between 18 and 34 is considered a youth in Kenya. So the discussion about youth and rural economy is a very critical discussion in terms of when we're trying to talk about the development of the economy of Kenya. Yes, Mr. Kenya.
Pretty much. But let me, if you allow me, take you back to that definition for what a rural area is. Do you think that we really entrenched the definition of a youth in a rural setting, or we are much inclined to a youth in, I would like to say, a metropolitan area, Willis?
Yes. I will agree that when we have most discussions, we fail to see a wholesome youth. We fail to see the youth in the rural area. Mostly discussions subconsciously think about the youth in an urban setup, the youth in a town, in a city. So we have really failed to look at the youth definition, considering the rural setup. Yes.
Pretty much. So let's begin now for talking about what we need to do, Willis, to sort of include this rural youth. Because then most of our definitions, when we talk about youth, we are sort of inclined to this guy in the metropolitan area.
I'm sorry, I lost you.
Yes, Willis, can you get me now? Just confirm that, sir.
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, let me reiterate that question. When we're talking about the youth and including them in the economy, I mean, must it start from the digital economy? And therefore, how are we going to encompass this rural youth in this inclusion?
Yes, I hope I got your question right, because most of it was I'm stuck on it. I think there was a network challenge. But about the youth inclusion, I mean rural youth inclusion.
Yes.
It's trying to look at. I mean, let's give some statistics here before we even continue. Right now, the population of Kenya, we talk about the youth making up about 35% of the population, and this is a very significant number if you're going to talk about any kind of development. And how do we now bring these youth to participate constructively in the economy? So that's what we call youth inclusion. From different perspectives. It could be social inclusion, it could be political inclusion. But for this discussion today, we're talking about economic inclusion. So what is this economic inclusion that we're talking about? How do youth participate in the economy? So there are several ways that youth can participate in the economy. They can get self-employed, or they can get into wage employment. So then what do they need as youth to get into? One of these, either wage employment or self-employment. They need skills. That's when we talk about empowerment. So how do we empower these youth to participate in wage employment or self-employment? So there are initiatives that actually are already ongoing, both from the government and from the private sector. The government is putting up policies, is putting up frameworks for youth empowerment. The private sector is doing the same because they both have roles to play. And actually, if you look at Kenya right now, there is a youth development policy, which outlines the role of government and the role of the private sector. And it lists responsibility of each. So maybe if you can look at a few of these responsibilities, and actually even the youth themselves have responsibility in terms of their own inclusion into the economy.
Yes.
So first of all, in terms of economic inclusion, we look at the skills. We look at things like employment. We look at things like financing. We look at things like talent development and innovation. So what role does the government have to play? The government needs to provide the requisite facilities to enable the youth to participate actively in the economy. The government needs to provide a conducive policy environment that will encourage even the private sector and the youth who take an active role in youth involvement in the economy. So this is a partnership approach. So no single entity is able to achieve youth inclusion, and especially rural youth inclusion. So let's say, for example, youths can work, youths can participate in sports, youths have talents that they can from. So how do youth exploit the talents, for example? You have to provide them with the facilities, like a stadium, for example, where they can play football, where they can play tennis, where they can play all these. If youths are to get into self-employment, they need to invest some money into, for example, in business. Where do they get this money? We talk about financial access now for the rural youth. If the youth, for example, are to be innovative, how do they innovation out there? So let's talk about incubation hubs. They bring in the ideas, and then they find people who can help them to build these ideas and make them into practical projects that can benefit them. So, yes.
Yes, Willis, let me just jump in, if you may, at that point. You raise a very key issue there, that nobody can sort of talk about youth inclusion by themselves. We have to look at it from a wider scope. I mean, if you look at what the government is pushing for, they've come up with a lot of development centers, incubation centers across the country. But then, Willis, we are also talking about a high number of youth who are finding themselves jobless despite this push from the government. Do you think that it has to be a concerted effort from both the private sector and the public sector to actually include this youth in the economy? And if so, Willis, then what needs to be done to attract the private sector to this youth?
Absolutely good question. So I will emphasize that point again, that no single entity, no single body can successfully empower the youth, and it is partnership. And just like I was saying before, if each has a role, the youth have a role, the state has a role, the private sector has a role. The youth must be patriotic and love. The youth must protect democracy. The youth must volunteer. The youth must create employment by themselves. The state must implement the youth policy. The state must provide quality education and skills. The state must secure tenure. The state must provide internship and volunteerism. And private sector has roles as well. They must create job opportunities, quality education. They must provide internship. They must provide entrepreneurial development, things like capacity building and training. So how can the government now attract this private sector to participate? Good question. It's very simple. There was already an initiative by government in terms of encouraging the private sector to involve the youth, for example, in skill building. by, for example, putting up tax incentives. If you have a certain number of youths who are fresh from college or fresh from some kind of training, then we will give you some kind of tax incentive that will will encourage you as a private sector practitioner to include more youths into your business. We can have more of these incentives, not only tax. There can be several of such incentives, and the government can also provide infrastructure, and the government can also provide skills to these youth. Because as a private sector, I will not take in a youth who has no skills because I need to do business. So the government has to provide the youth with skills, and the government is doing a very good job at that currently. You know that at least in every constituency right now, there's at least a TVC that is training the youth, and they're giving these youths practical skills. And I must love the government actually, because most of these new TVCs are now using the current technologies. There was a complaint by the private sector, before that most of the graduates from the TVCs were trained using old technology, using old. So when they come into the job market, they find a completely different scenario. So right now you can see that government is really doing a lot and building new TVCs, and these that are coming up, the new ones are coming up with the current skills and technologies. So government is doing good, and it must continue doing that. One important thing again is to do it in mass. A large number of the KCSE people in the KCSE will be going to the TVCs. And if we continue having these large numbers, so we will be having better and better skills, and the private sector will be, of course, be attracted to these new skills.
Pretty much. Willis, I gotta ask you this question. It's really important conversation point, especially when we're talking about now including this rural youth. I mean, Willis, you and I do know that devolution was touted as the biggest thing to happen to the Kenyan economy, sort of devolving these government functions, devolving this economy back to the roots. That it seemed to work for you, Willis, when we're talking about including this rural youth in the economy, or there's some sort of dysfunction somewhere?
Interesting, a very interesting question. If you look at devolution, I think devolution has done a lot, and has done a little in equal measure, depending on where you're talking from. So a lot of different governments have different priorities. And those that have youth as a priority, you will mostly see success in terms of youth inclusion. Those that have other priorities, you will likely see less youth inclusion. But again, this is something very critical to look at in a different perspective. What are the youth themselves in those areas doing? I mean, devolution has come, but not everything will come easy. We have to get them. So as youths living in the rural areas in these devolved units, what are we doing to be able to benefit from the fruits of devolution? I mean, there have been initiatives like funds that are available for youth entrepreneurs. There have been colleges, training facilities set up by county governments to train these youths. And they have even funded the existing training institutions to absorb more youth. And they have created avenues for youth to gain more skills, even those who are not able to go to the primary and secondary schools. So this, I think, devolution has worked quite well, but still it is a responsibility of the youth to seek these opportunities, because it is a matter of competition. Every youth needs this. So who is aggressive? Who knows what is where? And I think another important aspect that we have to look at is information. The devolved unit has made information more available at the grassroots level. So if something is happening at the county headquarters, it is easy for somebody in a village within that county to know than if everything was happening in Nairobi like it used to be before the new constitution. So I think devolution has been a success depending on the priority of that county, and again, depending on the aggressiveness of the youth in that area.
Yes. Willis, do you think that the digital economy can help us close this divide between this rural youth and this youth in the metropolitan economy in Kenya?
Very true. It is true that the digital age, in the digital age, in information age.
Yes, and Willis, I'm sorry to jump in, if you may then. If indeed that is true, where are we then in sort of including this rural youth in the digital economy?
Yes, that is a very critical issue to discuss, because it comes back to the issue of infrastructure.
Yes.
Digital infrastructure. And that is where there is a great disparity between the urban area and the rural area. I mean, it's easier to access internet from a town than it is to access internet from a village, for example, in northern Kenya. So because, for example, a private sector investor in telecommunications or in broadband will want to invest where there are more people, where there are maximum returns. So they would want to take the infrastructure to an urban area. So then you realize that in many rural areas, they're still using, for example, 2G internet.
Yes.
When we are moving to 5G internet. So the digital divide between the urban and the rural area is still very important thing to consider. And I think this is where now we need to have public investments in this kind of infrastructure to be able to bridge this divide. I mean, maybe the government can subsidize the private investors in terms of maybe building infrastructure, digital infrastructure in the rural area, so that the youth in the rural area is able to access digital services, almost equally as the youth in the urban area. Because this is information, and information is power. If we don't have this infrastructure in the rural area, then it's going to be very difficult to be able to bring together or to bridge the difference between the youth living in a town and the youth living in a village somewhere in the northern Kenya, east or the south or anywhere.
Yes. Well, as 2021 came, we're talking about it being a rebound year, but we're still under the grips of the coronavirus pandemic. Do you think that in some sort of way, or to what margin, that should be my question, to what margin has the coronavirus pandemic really set us back in terms of inclusion of the youth into the economy? And we're talking about this rural youth, Willis.
Let's look at it first from a global perspective.
Yes.
Statistics are showing that about 71 million people in 2020 were pushed into poverty globally. 710 million people were pushed into poverty. So this is a very significant number. If we extrapolate that to Kenya, that's about 500,000 people pushed into poverty. And talking about 35% being youth, that's still a very significant number of youth who have been pushed back into poverty. So let's look at these people from people maybe who are doing some kind of business, they're entrepreneurs, or they're working in a hotel somewhere, they're working in a bar somewhere. And now, because of COVID, they are now unemployed. Because of COVID, they have to find something else to do. So this has really pushed us back in terms of youth empowerment and youth inclusion, because the little gains that were made over time have been reversed significantly. And I'm sure it will take us a very long time to regain that, because Corona is still here with us. 2021, we had a lot of vacancies, still we have. I don't know by the end of this year what statistics and more pushed back into poverty again. But I'm just optimistic that there will be adequate measures by the government, by private sector, international development organizations to be able to cushion the developing economies, and especially the youth, and especially those in the rural areas, from the adverse effects of the pandemic, even as it continues. Yes. So that we may have to rebound faster than if things are left as they are right now. So we expect to see more focus or more involvement or more government and private sector push for youth inclusion, and even more aggressively than before the pandemic.
Pretty much. Well, it's a good thing, Assistant Manager, Private Sector Development, MSc. Thank you very much, sir, for taking your time this morning to speak to us here at Metropole Television.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kiagi. I was happy to be here.
Anytime. We take a short break. Once we come back, let's ask ourselves the question, what numbers are we relying on for the economic growth this year? Is it 3.9, 5.3? We'll be telling you the projections we're getting from chief economists in the economy this morning. And top of that, what is going on at KPLC? Do the PPAs that KPLC has signed for power acquisition, will they provide an answer to the performance of that entity once we come back here on Business Hour.